Hey guys, it's the Melblade 5. So, does anyone remember Cindered Shadows? It was the DLC campaign for Fire Emblem Free Houses in case people need a refresher, cause it kind of did just come and go. It's not like I was late to playing it or anything. I bought the expansion pass about a month before Cindered Shadows came out because I kept forgetting to do it sooner, and I beat the story in like 3 days upon its release, with the desire to make a video like this about it as a sequel to my initial Free Houses experience video to give my impressions on it. It just wasn't a priority at the time, and then it got pushed back a bit further, and then I got lazy when it came to starting the script. So we're in this weird phase of me talking about it when it's no longer really relevant. But I still wanted to give an account of all my reactions, experiences, and thoughts as I played through the story and its chapters. So when the final part of the Expansion Pass DLC got announced, from my initial impressions of the trailer, and the ideas I had for where this side story could go, it left me strongly anticipating for it to come out. Not to mention the obvious additions of extra story content with effectively a new but separated route containing new chapters, new classes, and most importantly, new characters as a fourth house was revealed. They did this kind of thing with Echoes' DLC, albeit the new characters were originally from Cypher, but I never bought it because 1, I forgot about it, and 2, it was really expensive. The total DLC cost more than the actual game. However, Cindered Shadows came at the right time and was interesting enough to the point I could actually care about it, and that's precisely what led to me finally getting around to buying the expansion pass and getting the hopes to tinker with the previously released sets of DLC from it at a later date. Then came the release day, the day before Valentine's Day, so it at least gave me something to do on that day rather than wallowing in misery at my loneliness. It was the strangest feeling to see Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude working together and being able to use all 3 of them. Plus, this being the first time I got to use Dimitri and Claude. But they also gave us Hilda, Ash, and Linhardt for some reason. I have no idea why from a gameplay standpoint they specifically chose these 3, unless they had the story and character backgrounds planned very early on. As I never got Hilda or Ash in my first playthrough, this was my first time using them as well. I thought Ash was alright, but he was greatly overshadowed by Claude, so he still can't catch a break. And while I heard that Hilda is really strong, my god, she was so helpful for a lot of this, cause she hit so hard and got quite a few crits when I really needed them. I found the smaller number of units and each having a set amount of classes to be a unique challenge, though I didn't have any issues with the limited resources restriction, since it felt like they gave you tons of resources anyway, and I didn't realize you could change classes until after beating the story, so that part added more difficulty where it wasn't necessary. Had I known that, I would have switched Edelgard to a warrior because I found Knight's shorter movement to be a pain in the ass for some chapters. Though on the upside, the Sword of the Creator's durability being restored after each chapter made me use it far more than what I did in my first playthrough. That being once. But I shouldn't be focusing so much on the existing characters, cause they aren't the main focus of Cindered Shadows. It's the new characters. The Ashen Wolves, consisting of 4 new students. Unfortunately, it wasn't the Purple Dolphin. So I'll go over all of them like I did for my first playthrough's team members. Yuri turned out very different to how I expected him to be, which is a good thing since I didn't have strong feelings towards him either way when seeing him in the trailer. The trailer gave me the impression that he was simply some ordinary member of the group, so it surprised me when I found out he was the house leader. But he does have that somewhat edgy, grey morality, anti-hero-like quality to his character that I really like in other characters for some reason, given his dark past relating to why he hides in the abyss and whoa! They actually used the word prostitute in a Nintendo game. Yuri also brings with him a new version of the Trickster class that's closer to how it was in Awakening, but now with the ability to use both forms of magic, at the cost of getting some ridiculous elf shoes. The standout features of Tricksters in this game is their exclusive skill, Foul Play, which opened up a whole bunch of strategies for me in this campaign. Being able to switch places with an ally over a pretty decent range really helped with getting characters over to a location where they could reach and kill an enemy, mainly Dimitri, as well as send out the tankier characters to lure enemies closer towards us. Plus, Yuri turned out to be quite a proficient unit in combat anyway. He has decent strength and skill, letting him deal noticeable damage, but I was not expecting him to have good resistance, so he also ended up being a bit of a magic tank, And his healing magic was pretty strong too, so he became my backup healer whenever Linhardt was too far away as well. While Yuri is personally my least favorite of the Ashen Wolves when it comes to personality and combat, that's not to say he's bad at all. Meanwhile, the repetitive king of grappling, Balthus, he's the tough, hardy, and often meat-headed strong guy of the group who only cares about fighting. I also strongly question how he can be considered a student at the monastery when he's 27! And that's before the time skip. Maybe he got held back a lot. What Balthus likely lacks an intelligence factor is certainly made up for with his combat prowess, as he's the obvious heavy-hitting and tanky character of the Ashen Wolves. Like Yuri, Balthus brings about the return of another class from Awakening, the War Monk. The class retains its standard utility of axes and healing, whilst now having a primary proficiency in brawling weapons too. I hardly ever used him for healing though. For my playthrough, he appeared to have very low magic, as he could only heal small, single-digit amounts of HP every time. So in that regard, I also used him as a backup healer when Linhardt wasn't available, similarly to Yuri, but only when there was literally no other option for faith magic. Instead, Balthus was a godsend by playing the same role as Caspar did in my first playthrough, whilst being my most defensive unit after Edelgard and Dimitri, being a safe option for me to send into enemy range since he could take hits fairly well and dish out twice the damage in return for every single hit with his brawling weapons. Especially the Vajra Mushti, or whatever, which almost always allowed him to attack 4 times with high damage, exactly like Caspar could do for me previously on so many occasions. I relied on it so much that there were multiple times I needed to get it repaired at the blacksmith so it wouldn't break. Even when it wasn't the enemy phase, he was still one of my go-to units for rushing in head first to take down some of the tougher enemies, particularly with demonic beasts, who in Chapter 5 couldn't even hit him at all. Caspar now has some real competition for the best brawler. In fact, I'm using Balthus on my slowly progressing second playthrough where I picked Golden Deer, just so I can decide who I prefer in terms of combat. Constance? She's my favorite! When I saw the Cindered Shadows trailer, she was the unit I gravitated to the most because she already had my favorite design out of the 4, plus she brings back another Awakening class being the Dark Flyer, a class that I hardly touched in that game, but I always liked its concept, and wanted to give it a chance, so it was the one I was most excited to see get added in the DLC. All my positive reception to her made perfect sense upon learning she's from the Adrestian Empire, since almost all the best characters are from there. Then by the time I played Cindered Shadows, she did not disappoint at all. I love how she makes everything sound so dramatic with her over-the-top and verbose speech patterns. She's like a female Zeke, but without the clumsiness. On the other hand, I found her quirk of suddenly changing personality when in sunlight to being woeful and self-deprecating to be pretty humorous, just because of her dialogue in these moments. This praise also carries over to her skill on the battlefield to a tremendous degree. I know others have made this statement before, but I really need to express it here. She's a flying Lysithia. Her magic attacks do so much damage and absolutely destroyed most enemies and bosses in the campaign, most often being backed up by her awesome personal skill that further increases her magic stat when on indoor maps. Due to being a Dark Flyer, she also has huge movement that can go over any surface to make reaching enemies a cinch. And if that wasn't enough, she also started off with bolting, which gives her a gigantic attack range. And that's still not the end, because of how awesome her crest is, giving her a chance to attack without consuming a use of the respective spell. I had this happen a couple of times with bolting in my playthrough, and it was a huge help to be able to use it more than twice and just decimate or severely weaken distant enemy forces. Her crest is already one of my favorites because of that. While she has virtually no defense and resistance to further mimic Lysithia, her flying status, giving her Canto on top of just being able to move over spaces that other types of units can't, allow me to avoid enemies exploiting that glaring weakness. And the other half of her personal skill, giving her increased defense and resistance when outdoors, does help a tiny bit in making it less of an issue. Out of all the Ashen Wolves, she was the one I relied on the most to beat the chapters, showing me the glory of House Nouvelle. And all of this regard became very awkward when I found out that her Japanese voice actress is mine. Watch out, Dimitri! Stay away from her! While Happy is not a flying blue cat, she is a pretty strong unit too. Her design made me think that she would be some weird emo girl. It's the eyes, goddammit. But instead, she turned out to be that teenage schoolgirl stereotype of being outwardly uninterested in everything, and is only slightly emo. She has the most negative outlook amongst the Ashen Wolves, but it comes across a lot more cynical, rather than being depressed all the time like I expected. Which still creates a massive contrast from her name. Then her emo-ness comes from her backstory of being another person experimented on by those who slither in the dark, specifically Cornelia, which resulted in her having this very bizarre curse. I don't know how this is supposed to work in-universe, but whenever she sighs, she attracts demonic beasts towards her. Like, why sighing? It's a good thing she doesn't watch my videos, otherwise there'd be a massacre. But, admittedly, I think a lot more of what I like about Happy has to do with her as a unit. She brings back Valkyries, which surprised me because I thought Holy Knights was supposed to be what this game calls Valkyries, and treated them as such the entire time. However, Valkyries in this game appear to lean closer towards Dark Knights, being mounted units that specialize in reason magic rather than being a mix of offensive magic and healing. While Happy's magic stat isn't as high as Constance's, and her movement is slightly limited by comparison due to being on the ground, she still greatly excels in those fields, which I found to be a huge help in many occasions, being the most reliable unit for fighting all of the damn golems that appear in the campaign. She also has better dexterity and resistance than Constance, which not only made her a bit of a magic tank as well, but also the one who got the most critical hits throughout the story. Like, way more. She probably got more than the others combined, as well as being the very first to get a critical hit, in which I was not expecting her to impersonate Petra given her laid-back attitude. Finally, while I never really got to take advantage of her personal skill, as she was often too far from demonic beasts to fight them, I can see it being very helpful in the main story. Once recruiting all of the Ashen Wolves and exploring Abyss, it was time to fight a bunch of bandits in a giant arena for a chapter that felt like it would never end. I took out a very large group of enemies in one corner, and then another large group appears in the adjacent corner with no heads up. And after fighting for a time that already started to feel on the long side for a standard chapter, once those guys were defeated, another group appeared in the next corner, with even more enemies that also took forever to beat just on their own. And when I thought they couldn't possibly add any more enemies to this chapter...
You can't escape me! I'll chase you to the ends of the earth!
I didn't even bother with Death Knight. He was too far away and moving very slowly for some reason. And with that chapter finally finished, I got another introduction.
I am relieved that I wasn't too late. I do hope my presence proved useful.
He's evil! I'm calling it right now! You can't have a dude wear red and black robes and not expect him to be evil. Well, anyway, moving on to finding the Chalice of Beginnings.
Say, are we beneath the bridge in the monastery?
And there are now 4 people fighting on it for some reason. Just as I had gotten over how long the previous chapter was, this was a complete nightmare in length. It took me 23 turns to finish, all for one simple reason.
The years start coming and they don't stop 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 coming.
As for chapter 4, it can also be summed up in one gag. I like them trying to do something different with the structure of this chapter, but they once again went overboard with the reinforcements at the final stretch. They also deceived me because by the time I got everyone past the first destination point, the remaining turn count hadn't been reset, so I restarted the chapter thinking I somehow had to do the whole thing in just 10 turns. Luckily, Chapter 5 was a mostly standard chapter with few reinforcements, so I didn't have to deal with being constantly bombarded again. So once that was done, I got to the plot twist that Elfric is evil! Oh my god! I totally did not see that coming! My mind is blown! But in all seriousness, the other twist of Yuri seemingly betraying the others did somewhat catch me by surprise. But back to Elfric. Why does he want the Chalice so badly? This actually left me stunned and freaking out. I couldn't believe that this story was really centered around shedding light on Byleth's mum, aside from just revealing her name earlier. So Elfric ends up being a clone of Snape by being madly in love with Citri, leading to him becoming the world's biggest simp by wanting to use the Chalice and Ashen Wolves' blood to resurrect her. Not exactly the most intricate villain, but I guess I'll have to roll with it. For the penultimate chapter, I honestly didn't think this had much of a difficulty increase compared to the previous one. When it came to rescuing the Ashen Wolves, the hardest part was fighting Elfric because he uses Dorothea's meteors on steroids when at a distance, forcing me to only attack when the RNG was on my side and he'd have less accuracy to prevent anyone from dying. But once those opportunities came, I made sure to go all out. Now it was on to the final battle where Elfric commences the Rite of Rising. Big surprise, it ends up going wrong, and thus he and Citri's corpse are merged together to create this thing. This was chapter 3 in boss form, because it also took me fucking forever to beat. I honestly don't remember the exact turn counts, but I think it was at or just before 20. Most of my units did next to or no damage to him, while he could kill a good chunk of them instantly, and has a shit ton of health that gets bigger alongside some really good skills with each health bar depleted. I had to spend so much time just healing everyone because of his super attack that does a lot of damage to everyone before he teleports himself and everyone else to different locations. Meaning in those events, I had to spend time trying to move any less defensive units that were warped into his range the fuck out of there. For this whole battle, Byleth, Edelgard, and Dimitri were my only consistent attackers to the boss itself with their combat arts. Hilda got used at one point when he somehow had less defense as he was charging up his super attack, and luckily she got a crit. Yuri, Linhardt, and all the vulneries and elixirs I got along the way were my healers, and as for everyone else...
I'm going to kill you, and then kill you again!
Finally, after all that frickin' time, I repeated the end of my first playthrough and finished him off with the Sword of the Creator. Afterwards, the Ashen Wolf House is disbanded, and all its members get to live proper lives on the surface, free from having to hide. And with that, it is the end. I've seen a lot of discussions on if Cindered Shadows is worth the price you have to pay, considering you need to buy the entire expansion pass in order to get it, with all of them saying no. So I kind of want to throw in my thoughts on the subject as I go over my impressions of Cindered Shadows as a whole. I don't feel as pessimistic as those other people when wondering, is it worth it? Solely because of the additions to the main game you get with downloading Cindered Shadows, like recruiting the Ashen Wolves, promoting to their classes, and accessing all the Abyss features. But I do think that Cindered Shadows itself could have been better. Not so much from the gameplay side of things, because most of the chapters were fine, save for the hard-on they had for golems in Chapter 3. It was the plot where a lot of my major gripes with the campaign came from. Most of that stems from how predictable the Elfric is evil twist was, as well as how I found Elfric himself to be a pretty lame villain. I couldn't really take him seriously as this intended big bad antagonist because he never once appeared threatening to me in either his appearance or mannerisms, and his simpy motivations made him come across as more of a weirdo stalker rather than some serious threat. It's also strange that the plot largely revolves around Citri, yet Geralt doesn't make a physical appearance at all when this takes place before his death. But that's another topic. I think they could have made Elfric a better villain if they at least made him a sympathetic one, rather than appearing to be mentally deranged and thus less able to understand his actions. In fact, what I thought was going to happen with the Elfric twist was that he would turn out to be a member of those who slither in the dark, with the Chalice and Rite being an earlier attempt to resurrect Nemesis. I think that idea alone could have brought a bunch of opportunities to make Cindered Shadows more interesting and give it a stronger tie to the main game. And if you really want to have Elfric's love for Citri in there, then you could have him go rogue and try to use the Rite on her instead, or better yet, have Chalice or someone else promise to bring Citri back to persuade him to join them in the first place. Because I still like how the story does give us more information about Citri. I really thought my exact prediction was going to be true because there's mention of someone who destroys entire villages for experimentation, which immediately made me think of Solon. And when Elfric is captured, he's held by those who slither in the dark mages, which I thought meant that this was all a setup by them. So the fact that isn't what they went with, whilst not having much substantial in its place, felt very strange. Regardless, I still didn't see it as an absolute waste of time, because when putting those issues to the side, I did have fun with it. And the additions to the main game have, and I know are going to, mix things up a little bit in my aforementioned second playthrough. Plus, we did get some very strong recruitable characters out of it, and what made me fall in love with Fire Emblem in the first place was the gameplay and characters, so it certainly wasn't all bad for me in the end.